Welcome to a new style here on the channel. I want you to dive into the story in a different way. From now on, the visuals won't be the main focus. Instead, I want you to feel each word, each detail, as the sound of rain creates the perfect atmosphere for the story you're about to hear. Now I invite you to close your eyes, or let the video play while you relax in a quiet place, whether that's your room with the lights off, or even in the car on a night drive. I'll guide you into this experience. And if you're listening with headphones, get ready because every sound is designed to make you feel the tension of the story. By the way, where are you listening to this story from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Javier. I'm 32 years old, born and raised here in Buenos Aires. I've been working at a car repair shop for years, I think since I was 19. It was something my dad always taught me, how to handle a car, work with the engine, change a tire, things like that. He always said the world could do without a lot of things, but never without people who could fix what was broken. I've always been the kind of guy who believed in that. My family isn't big, but we're close. We're of Italian origin, and that means we almost always get together on Sundays for lunch that my mom insists on preparing. I'd say we're all simple folks, living with what we have, and we're not the type to believe in weird things. My dad especially was always a skeptic, saying that if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. And I guess I grew up kind of believing that too. A few months ago, I managed to save up some money and moved into my own apartment. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. And just thinking about that gave me a certain satisfaction. It's in a pretty quiet neighborhood in the city. Not one of those old buildings, just a simple 3-story building with narrow hallways and no elevator. The kind of place where you can hear your neighbor dragging a chair on the other side of the wall, you know? As soon as I moved in, I didn't see much of the neighbors. People were coming and going, but I didn't really get to meet anyone. And look, I'm the type of guy who at least says good morning. To the right of my apartment, for example, I always heard sounds. Like there was someone living there, but I never crossed paths with them. I kept thinking it was maybe someone who left really early or got back really late, and our schedules just didn't match up. One night, just as I was settling in, I started noticing the noises more frequently. At first it was small things, like footsteps crossing the apartment next door, or a door opening and closing. And you think, it's an apartment. This is normal. I thought the same, especially since I'd just moved in, and it didn't make sense to get bothered by every little thing. But as time passed, these sounds started to repeat in a way I didn't expect. Always around 9 at night, I'd hear the same pattern. Footsteps, a creaking sound like a door, and sometimes a low, muffled voice. I even thought it might be my imagination or some kind of acoustics problem with the building. But it wouldn't stop. Even when I'd get home later or leave earlier, it seemed like those sounds were always there. At one point, I started thinking maybe it was the plumbing or something because you know how these older buildings are, right? The breaking point was one Friday night. I got back from the shop later than usual and decided to stop by a little store in the neighborhood to grab a beer and relax. When I got to the apartment, it was almost 11 at night. I put the beer on the table and sat down on the couch, but out of nowhere, there were those noises again. Only this time it seemed clearer. It was like someone was walking from the bedroom to the living room, opening and closing doors and talking to themselves. I even turned down the TV to make sure I was hearing it right. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to take a look and see if I can find this neighbor. I grabbed my keys and stepped out into the hallway. I rang the doorbell for the apartment next door and waited. Nothing. I tried again, and still no answer. I stood there for a second, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. But then, once again, I heard a noise. It was faint, like someone was inside. I knocked on the door with my fingers just to see if anyone would respond. At that moment, curiosity won over embarrassment. I went down to the lobby and asked the doorman if he knew who lived in that apartment. He looked at me strangely and said that apartment had been empty for months, ever since the last tenant moved to the countryside to be closer to her family. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and I felt embarrassed to ask more, so I just thanked him and went back upstairs. But that night, the sounds didn't stop. I went back to my apartment trying to ignore it, thinking that maybe the doorman was mistaken, or that maybe someone had moved in and he just didn't know yet. But each time those noises came back, I grew more suspicious. On the third night after that, I decided I'd try once more. I went to the hallway and just stood there, leaning against the wall, waiting to hear something. And it didn't take long. I heard footsteps again, and this time clearly the sound of a door opening and closing. The next morning, as I left for work, I saw the doorman and took the opportunity to ask again, just to clear up any doubt. He laughed, said he was sure, and even told me that the apartment was going to be listed for rent again. But no one had seen any sign of anyone being there since the last tenant left, and he assured me that nobody was currently using that apartment. The following days were torture. I'd get home, sit on the couch, turn on the TV, and try to pretend nothing was happening. But the sounds kept coming, always the same way, always at the same time. And the worst part is, the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to bother me. One night I even considered calling the police, but then I thought, what am I going to say? That I'm hearing footsteps in an empty apartment? Can you imagine the look on their faces? After a few weeks, the noises stopped being just a curiosity and started to affect my sleep, my daily life. I'd wake up more tired, couldn't focus on work, and all I could think about was that, every night, someone or something was in the apartment next door. I even ended up putting a camera on my door, hoping to catch some weird movement. But of course, nothing ever showed up. One night, I decided to take a more direct approach. I went into the apartment and turned up the music, trying to drown out the noises. But to my surprise, even with the sound at full volume, I could still hear the footsteps and the creaking doors. It was like it was inside my own head. I reached a point where I can't even explain. It felt like I was no longer the same Javier as before, the guy who only believed in what he could see. In the end, I did something that I still don't know if it was brave or just plain stupid. I left the apartment, went to the doorman, and told him I was handing in my key. He didn't understand anything, of course, asked if something had happened, and I just said I didn't feel comfortable there. He insisted I explain, but I just said I needed to leave. That place wasn't for me. I packed my things and went back to my parents' house. To this day, I haven't told them or anyone else about what happened. I think my dad would laugh in my face, say I was being dramatic. But I know what I heard. I know what I lived through in that apartment. I'm Leroy. I live in New Orleans, born and raised here. I'm a carpenter. I've been doing this since I was a teenager. I learned the trade from my grandfather. In our family, it's always been a thing to pass down the profession from father to son, like it's some kind of tradition. My grandpa used to make furniture for half the city, so I grew up watching him hammer sandwood, that strong smell of varnish that you get used to after a while. Now I have my own shop and a few regular clients that help pay the bills. It's no luxury, but it's enough to live on. I have a wife, Sarah, and a daughter, Emma, who's 8 now. Emma is my reason for living. Ever since she was born, the house got livelier, with toys scattered on the floor and that good noise of a kid playing. One thing about Sarah is that she has this belief in spiritual things. She always says we need to respect old objects, that they hold energy, that sort of thing. I've always been more skeptical, more down to earth. But after what happened, I admit a few things have changed. It all started because Emma has a passion for old toys, dolls, those vintage things, you know? She's always looking at antique magazines with her mom, and every time we pass by a pawn shop, she stops to look in the windows. I always found it kind of odd for a kid, but I never gave it much thought. Once, on my way back from a job, I passed by one of those stores and saw a doll I thought she'd like. It was one of those with a porcelain face, blue eyes, and curly hair, wearing a kind of faded dress. It looked like a find. I imagined her smile and couldn't resist. I brought the doll home that night, and Emma loved it, of course. She was so excited, placed the doll on a shelf in her room with the others. Sarah, on the other hand, gave me a strange look and said the doll had a heavy feeling. She said maybe it wasn't a good idea to leave it in Emma's room, but I, being stubborn, thought she was exaggerating. After all, it was just a doll. Well, that same night, the first strange thing happened. It was late, about 2 in the morning, I think. Sarah and I were in our room, and out of nowhere we heard a sound like someone was walking down the hallway. Small steps, very light. Sarah woke up first and nudged me, asking if I was hearing it. I said it was probably Emma walking around in her room, but she insisted that she heard little giggles along with the steps. We got up, went to Emma's room, and what we saw was kind of unsettling. Emma was sleeping deeply, but the doll, which had been on the shelf before, was now lying on the floor, far from where Emma had left it. I thought maybe Emma had thrown it down before bed. Kids do those things, right? Even so, Sarah wasn't satisfied and kept telling me we should find a way to get rid of the doll. But I insisted it was just a coincidence, that there was nothing wrong with the doll. We went back to sleep, but I admit I was a bit unsettled. The next day I went to the workshop, but my mind was kind of elsewhere, thinking about that doll on the floor and Sarah's reaction. When I got home, Sarah came right up to me and said she'd heard giggles again during the day, even though it was just her and Emma at home. She swore it was the doll, but I kept thinking it was just her paranoia. But that same night, things went further. We went to bed, and it was around 2:30 in the morning when I heard those little steps again. This time it seemed clearer, and you could hear a low, muffled laugh. I froze for a moment, that kind of silence where even the sound of breathing feels too loud. Sarah, lying beside me, whispered that I should go see what was happening. I got up slowly and went to Emma's room, trying not to make a sound. When I went into her room, I saw Emma was still asleep, but the doll... Well, it wasn't just on the floor. It was sitting facing Emma's bed with that empty stare, glassy eyes shining in the dark. This time I couldn't fool myself. I stood there feeling a chill running up my back and went back to our room as quickly as I could. Sarah just looked at me and understood that it wasn't just in her head. We decided that the next day, first thing, the doll would be out of the house. No more chances. When morning came, I put the doll in a bag and took it back to the pawn shop. The shop owner, an old man, gave me a strange little smile when I explained I wanted to return it. I asked him where he'd gotten that doll, and he just laughed, saying it showed up from time to time, like the shop attracted it back. I didn't think much of it. I just wanted it gone. When I got home, I felt relieved, but Emma was sad when she found out. I tried to explain that the doll wasn't good, but how do you explain something like that to a kid? She cried a bit, but soon forgot about it. But somehow the doll didn't forget us. The next night when we went to bed, a strong smell of lavender started filling the room. It was the same smell the doll had, a strange, slightly sickly smell. I went to Emma's room just to check, and she was sleeping peacefully. But that smell, it was stronger there. I looked at the shelf, half expecting to see the doll back, but it wasn't there. I felt like I was being watched, but I shook my head, thinking I was losing it. After that day, nothing happened for a while. Life went back to normal, but Sarah still felt uneasy sometimes. She said she'd see shadows now and then or hear those little footsteps again. I didn't see anything, but that strange feeling that something was off in the house stayed with me. Months passed and things calmed down, but one night when I was home alone, I heard those muffled giggles again coming from Emma's room. It was a distant sound, but unmistakable. I went to the room with my heart pounding. Emma wasn't there. She'd gone to sleep at a friend's house, but the sound continued softly, as if it were laughing at me. I looked in every corner of the room, but I found nothing. The sound stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy silence. I closed Emma's bedroom door, went back to mine, and tried to forget about it. But since then, every time I go into her room, I have this feeling that the doll, even far away, is still with us. I've told this story to a few friends, and of course, many think it was just paranoia, that I was just overtired and all that. Maybe it was, who knows, but I can't forget those little giggles and the footsteps I heard more than once. I can't explain it, and maybe it's better not to try. I know it sounds like something out of a movie, but I swear, after this, my head has never been the same. I started listening to Sarah a bit more. Paying attention to those things I used to call superstitions. I'm not so skeptical anymore. I've learned that sometimes there are things we just don't understand, and there's a line between the world we see and the one we feel that's better left respected. My name is Sarah. I live in a small town in Maine. I'm about 27 years old and work at a local coffee shop. It's a small place with those old wooden counters that creak when you lean on them, but it's what supports me. I've been working there for about 5 years. It's not the best pay in the world, but the tips help, and it's the kind of job where you get to know everyone's routine. There's Mr. James, who always orders the same black coffee and spends the day reading the newspaper. And there's Anne, who brings her little boy and stays for a long time just to chat a bit. My family is from here too. My parents were born and raised in the town, and we come from a line of simple folks. My grandparents, before they passed away, lived here too. I grew up listening to Halloween stories because my dad loved this time of year. He always said that Halloween was the time when the other side got closer to us. My mom was never really one to believe in these things, but my dad had a certain respect for the date. Well, I'm going to tell you what happened that Halloween party, because it's something that still gives me chills to this day. The town always throws a big party at the community hall, and it's a tradition for us to go. Most people come in costume. Some wear those cheap store costumes, others go all out, and some just throw on anything to say they're in the spirit. I decided to dress as a witch. I grabbed an old black dress and bought a hat at a convenience store. The hall was already packed when I got there, and classic Halloween songs were playing. At one point, while I was talking with some people I knew, I noticed a strange man in the corner of the room. He was wearing a costume that, from afar, looked simple, but there was something about it that bothered me. It was all black, like a cloak, and his face was covered by an old mask that looked like it was made of some worn-out material. It wasn't a plastic mask. It seemed, I don't know, like it had been used for a long time. He stood there, still, and his posture gave me an uneasy feeling. He was a little away from everyone else, and while everyone danced or laughed, he just watched. When someone passed by, he didn't react, just looked. With those eyes, I could barely see through the mask. He seemed out of place there. The party went on, and I got distracted with other friends. Had a few beers, ate some snacks, the usual. But every time I looked toward the corner, there he was, unmoving. At some point, I thought maybe he was trying to scare people, like a prank. So I decided to get closer to try to start a conversation or maybe laugh at the costume. But as I got nearer, he moved back a bit, like he didn't want to be bothered. I tried to say something, but he turned his back and walked slowly to the other side of the hall. I kept watching, kind of intrigued. I thought he might be one of those people who come to the party just to stay on the sidelines, without socializing, which isn't very common around here because everyone knows each other. So I started asking others if anyone knew who the guy was. No one seemed to have any idea. Some thought he was a cousin of someone. Others said maybe he was from a nearby town, but no one knew for sure. And the more I asked, the stranger I felt. At some point, while I was chatting with a friend, I lost sight of him. I looked around trying to spot him in the crowd, but he seemed to have vanished. I asked my friend if she'd seen the guy in the black cloak, but she said she hadn't. At that moment, I even thought maybe I'd had too much to drink and started imagining things. I went home that night with that image in my head, of that man standing in the corner of the room, with that mask that looked kind of old and creepy. I thought that by the next day it would fade from my mind like any vague memory of a party. But that's not what happened. The next morning, while I was at the coffee shop, I heard someone mention something on the radio. They said they'd found the body of a man who had been missing for days. I got curious, of course, because around here, when something like that happens, everyone finds out. The strangest part was they said the man was last seen in town, but his body hadn't been found yet. And that's when I saw the photo. The face that appeared on my coworker's phone screen was the same one I had seen at the party. I mean, not the face, but the shape, the size, the posture. The costume was the same. It was him. I felt a strange chill, you know. because in my mind, that man was dead. That's what the news said. He had been missing for a week and his family hadn't heard from him. His name was Jonathan, a guy I had never seen around here. He wasn't from town, but he had some relatives in a nearby city. I stood there, frozen, trying to process it. And the first thing that crossed my mind was that maybe someone was trying to scare people at the party by wearing a costume similar to the missing man's. But Ate, why would anyone do that? I couldn't concentrate on work that day. I took my car and went to the police station because I needed to ask if they had found anything or knew of someone wearing a similar costume at the party. I mentioned to the officer about the man in the black cloak, but he just looked at me like I was saying something silly. He said they were investigating, but they had no leads on the body's whereabouts. That night, as I went back home, I couldn't get the image of the man out of my head. I remembered the details, the way he stood, that mask that looked so real that, at that moment, it seemed impossible it was just a regular costume. My mom, who never believed in these things, even told me I should stop thinking about it. But I knew what I'd seen. For weeks, there was no news about the case, and I almost started to believe I had exaggerated things in my head. But a month later, the police found his body in a forest near town. They said he'd been there for days, but no one had found him before because the area was dense. And then I found out something else strange. The body was wearing the same clothes I'd seen at the party. It didn't make sense because no one else, besides me, seemed to have noticed him that night. To this day, I don't know what happened at that Halloween party. I don't even know if it was my imagination, but one thing I'm sure of. What I saw that night, no one else did. The image of that man still haunts me. I think of him sometimes, especially when I get home alone and hear the wind hit the window. I can't help but wonder if maybe somehow what I saw that night wasn't just someone playing a prank.